Now that we have all of that theoretical knowledge, we also want to have a look at this practical case study in which we want to set up a complete end-to-end ETL workflow, and with that also see how things look like in practice and what is practically relevant there. And I also want to mention that this section is completely optional and only if you are interested in this practical demonstration, because this will be just a practical part, a practical example. But I think it anyways can be very helpful to have seen such a demonstration, and if you want, of course, optionally, you can even work along with me. And that's why in this quick lecture, we want to have a look at what is our plan. So we want to get an overview of this case study and see all of the steps that we are going to take. So in this first lecture, we want to have a look at the situation, we want to have a look at the source data, and with that we want to develop also a plan. That means we want to design our fact tables and our dimensions. And then once we have done that, we of course want to set up the table structure and the schema in our database management system. And then once we have set up this, we can go ahead and design our staging, of course, for our fact table and for the dimensions potentially if we have some additional dimensions. And then afterwards, we also need to set up the core layer for the dimension as well as for the fact tables. And with that, we can now put things together and place them together into a job. And this will be then our ETL. And of course, we need to also test it then with data. And we want to also test, of course, the full load and also then the incremental load, so the delta load. And this will be then our entire workflow, and we will then see if we can put this into practice and if it really works. So now we want to start immediately with having a look at our source data. And of course, we also want to then design our fact tables and our dimensions. So this is what we are going to do in the next lecture. Now let's have a look at the source data that we are going to work with. Of course, you also find this file attached in this lecture in the resources, so you can download it, and if you want, you can work along with me. But also it is completely fine if you just watch along and just consider this as a demonstration. So this is the file that we have. This is sales data, and it is related also to our product dimension that we have loaded previously. We can see that also that there is this product ID. And in here we have just different transactions, and we in this lecture want to develop a plan. What will be our final table design for this fact table, and what could be also the dimensions. So how are we going to process this source data into dimensions, into facts? What do we need to do? And that's why we first want to start with bringing this data into our source system. So we just want to load it into the public schema, which is basically in our case just serving as a source data. So that's why we now want to go to PG admin, and also in the resources you find this text file in which we have the SQL code that we are going to use. So also go ahead if you want, open that up, and then you can just copy it. And in this code we just want to create this table. So we can just select it and then execute this code. This just contains all of the columns that are in the source data as well as the data types. So I'm just selecting it, hitting F5, and then it will be returned and the table will be created. Now if you are in the public schema, you can just on the tables right click and hit refresh, and then the table should be available. Of course, now if we select it, we see that it is still empty, and that's why we need to of course import this data from that CSV file. We do that by just right clicking on the sales table, and there we find import export data. Of course, make sure to set import in the top line, and then we can select our file. So we can just click on this folder symbol and then if you have downloaded this file, you can just navigate to the folder where this file is stored, and then we can select it, click on select, and now we just make a few more settings. So the header is included in this file, that's why we check that, and also the delimiter in the CSV file is a comma. And this is basically all that we need to do. We can now immediately click on OK, and then the data has been imported successfully. So we can again verify that by selecting this code, hitting F5, and the data is sitting there. Now, how do we plan to design our fact table? So that's why we want to now have a look at this data. We can see the first column is a transaction ID. This is our primary key, and in our case it is a natural key, but it is also already a perfect surrogate key because it is really already in numbers, and that's why we don't need to add any additional surrogate key here, because basically it is already a perfect key. And then we have now this very interesting transactional date. In fact, it is a timestamp, and this is why we should use this column as our delta column to also later on enable the incremental load. So that's why this is our delta column, and we want to use that for the incremental load. We can see here then the product ID, which is the natural key of our dimension table, and we want to also include the surrogate key, so our key that we have set up for our product dimension. That's why we also want to bring in not only this natural key, but the product foreign key. So the primary key, surrogate key from the dimension table. Then we also have the customer ID. This is some potential key for an additional customer dimension, which we are not going to use, but still we should have this included because maybe in the future we still want to use a customer dimension, and then we have this already set up. So this is great. Then we see that we have payment, credit card, and loyalty card. So loyalty card and payment, we can see the payment only takes 3 different values and the loyalty card only 2. So only false and true. So this looks like a junk dimension, and we can implement this both together. So we have basically 6 different combinations of payment and loyalty. And this will be then placed in our separate so-called junk dimension. So this is these 2 information. The credit card we can see is just a number, but there is no associated information, and that's why this is kind of a degenerate dimension. So this means that we can just leave it in the fact table and just use this as a value in itself without linking to an additional dimension. And now in the end, we have those 3 measures. And note that the cost and the price is now for each of these products. And we can have a quantity that is larger than 1. And that means that if we want to have the total price, the total sales amount of this transaction, we would need to multiply the price with the quantity. And also the same goes for the cost. Also, if we want to have the entire cost, we need to multiply it with the quantity. And this will be an additional measure that we can set up to have also calculated the total cost and also the total price. So with that, we have a really nice and additive measure that can be easily added up, and we get a value that really does make sense. So with that total cost and total price, we can then also calculate the total profit. So this will be the 3 columns that we also want to set up. So this is our plan. We have now the plan for our fact table design as well as our payment dimension. So this is now what we want to set up. And now we also want to have a look at this design and all of the steps that we are going to take. So of course, this is something that we have forgotten. We also need to create a date key. So you see that in this table with the transactional date, we have the date and the time. In our case, for our analysis, the time is not so important. That's why in our use case, we can just leave this away, but we can just keep this timestamp, but we need to also create an additional date foreign key that is linking to our date dimension that we've set up previously. So this will be our first step. Afterwards, we've mentioned we also need to include the foreign key for the product dimension. Then we want to set up the payment dimension. This is the junk dimension that we've talked about. And of course, then also we want to calculate our additional columns. So we said we want to add total cost, total price, and then also the profit. So this is our plan. And then with that, our final table is going to look something like this. So we have the transaction ID kept as our key. We have also the timestamp kept, but then we have this date foreign key that is referencing our date dimension. Then we have also the product ID, natural key we can leave, but we also want to have the foreign key included as well as the foreign key for the payment. And you see we have a few dimensions, and you see it's more than 6. Actually, there's also apparently 8, but we will see that later on in practice. Then also this credit card we still have as a degenerate dimension. And then in the end, we have calculated also our additional measures. So this is our final table. And now with that in mind, we can design and set up now our tables and the table structure in pgadmin. After which we can then design our ETL in Pentao. Now that we've created our final table design, we want to set up the tables in pgadmin, so in our database management system, and after that we can then design our data ingestion, all of the data extraction, all of the transformation, and our entire ETL workflow. That's why we now want to immediately head over to pgadmin, and of course again in the resources you find this text file, and in there is all of the code that we are going to use to just set up quickly our tables. And we of course want to now first copy all of that code and paste it in here. So we want to start with setting up our sales fact table for staging. And note that in here we just have all of the same table structure as in our source data, because we just want to extract the data without doing any additional transformations. That's why we just set up the exact same table structure, except that now it is in our staging environment. So we select everything and then we execute the code. Table should be now set up. Afterwards, we want to also create the sales table for the core layer. But now note that the table structure is our final table design. So we have all of the foreign keys and all of the additional columns that we want to create. So this is what we also want to execute. Table should be now also created. And afterwards, we also want to create our payment table. So this will be our dimension, and note that in here we only need the core layer, because we don't need to stage anything, because we just basically take all of the information from the sales table. And this sales table is already staged, and that's why we don't need to have any additional staging in here. So what is this table structure? We have seen we have the primary key. This is our surrogate key that we are going to create. And this is also just the code to also set up a incrementing, a sequence basically. So every new row will have an additional value. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Then we also have, of course, these two attributes, payment and loyalty card, and we all want to have all of the combinations. And in this case, we set just the primary key, and this is the payment column in here. So this payment PK. So this is our dimension payment. We can also execute that, and with that we have already set up our entire table structure. Now we are ready to go into PDI and design our staging for our fact table. So this is what we are now going to do in the next lecture. Now we are in Spoon and we want to set up the staging for also our fact table. Remember that we have already set up the staging for our product dimension. And also in here we have this additional workflow created for transform and load. And if we have a look at this one, we see that this is basically more really the thing that we want to have later on in our core layer, because we already read the data from staging, and this is why we want to create a separate job later on for the core layer. For now, we just want to create the staging layer and all of the data extraction. So we have done that already. We have set the variable and get the data, write it into the staging layer for our product table. And that's why in this job, we want to remove the transform and load. But we want to create now a transformation, so a workflow also for our staging fact table. So that's why we go to File, New, and then we want to set up a new transformation. This will be now first for our variable. And we remember that if we have a look into pgadmin, we can again execute and have a look at the source data. So we see this is just select star from public sales. We want to use this timestamp as our delta column. And that's why we first want to extract the maximum value from this data that is already loaded in the core layer. And this is then what we want to use as our delta column and decide if we have loaded that data in the source already or not. So that's why in the first step we want to set this variable, and afterwards we can then use that variable for our delta load. That's why in our first transformation we want to set up the variable, and we do this exactly in the same way as we have also done it in here. So basically we can even just copy that, so we just hit Control C and then we can just paste it in here. Of course, we have to adjust things in here. So we, in our case, don't want to use the product ID, but we want to use the transactional date. So that's why we don't want to use the product ID, but we want to use the transactional date. And then we want to don't pull this, of course, from the product dimension, but from our sales table. And core indeed is what we want to load this from. And of course, now we can also quickly preview and we see just if it works, but of course there is no data yet. That's why we don't get any value in that. And also the naming we can improve a little bit. So we don't need to call it max, but we can give it another alias. So we can say this is, for example, last load date. And then it's just a little bit more descriptive. But note that actually we want to, in the beginning, as we don't have any data there, we want to also use just a dummy value so that we can initiate the full load in the beginning. So we manually just set this to a very old date, and then afterwards we can again just comment that out so we don't use that. But in the beginning, we actually do want to use that instead of this one. This will be just basically for the incremental load. So we can also just comment that this is for delta load, and later on we can activate this. In the beginning, we just use that as a full load. We can again preview and see if it works, and indeed this is great. So now we have set up our variable, but of course also in here we want to rename it, so we can say that this is of course not the maximum, but now it's the last load date. Variable name, we can also call this last load date, and this is fine for us then. We can now, like this, simply click on OK. So this is fine. And now that we have this, we can also save it, and we can just call this set last load. So we save that as a new file, and we want to call this set last load, and we can also include sales. So we save it, and now that we have that, we also want to get last load and actually load the data. So we are going to create a new transformation, and for this one we want to now get the variable first. So we can search for get variable, and we double click again, and in this case, let me again double click, we want to now get the variable, and we can use the variable as we have seen it with a dollar and then these curly brackets, and this time it's last load date, what we have called this variable, and of course the name is not super important, just the field name basically that will be retrieved. Again, we can just call it last load date. And the type is now important that we set it as a timestamp. So this is what we need to select in here. And the rest is not super important. We can see if there's a preview. Indeed, it works. So this is fine. And we can now click on OK. And now, of course, we want to get the data from the table. So we can say table, and this should be table input. Now we want to select everything from our source data. So this will be public.sales, and now we want to use this where condition. And of course, now it should be transactional date, so our delta column, and only what is larger than what we have already loaded. So this will be our variable, and we can just call that variable by the $, and then this curly bracket, and we call last load date. So this is the variable, and of course when we do that, we also need to check replace variables in script. And this is then how we want to load. We can click on OK, but of course also we should preview and test if everything works as expected. That's what we are doing, and we can see indeed everything works. So this is now great. And now with that, of course, we want to again save it and put things now together in our staging. And yes, a quick note from here, we have indeed forgotten to also output the data, so to also write it into our staging tables. But we will notice that later on, and then we will also add that. For now, we can just leave it as it is. This is fine. And now we want to save the file. So that's why we want to also go to save as. And this will be now called get last load sales, and then we can save that as well. And now in the staging job, we can put things together and then we can test it. And this is also what we are going to do in the next lecture. Now that we've set up our two transformations, set last load and get last load, we can put things together in our staging job and complete things with that. So that's why we want to add in this job two additional transformations. So 1 and 2. So those we can connect to our entire workflow. So this will be like this. And then we can, of course, in the first one, we can name it. So this will be set variable for sales. We can just leave it like this, and then we want to search for the transformation. Of course, now again we need to enter the path where this is stored, so we can just copy that, paste the path in here, and there we find now our saved transformations. So we want to start with set last load date, so we can scroll down and we see then in here we have set last load, and we can just select that. Then once we have done that, we can go ahead with the next one. In here we can again name it get variable for sales and basically also load. We can also write that. It's a bit long, but this will help us to understand what this workflow is doing. So then again we want to browse, go to the folder path again, and now search for get last load. We find get last load in here, we can select it, and now everything is included. So now we want to, of course, test out if this is really working. So this is always the moment where we are in a way hoping that it works and that there are no bugs. So I will also now test it live, and then we will check in the database management system if this is really doing what it's supposed to do. And indeed, everything looks great. So at least there were no errors in here. But of course, now we need to also go to pgadmin and check if also now in the staging table, the data is included. So I'm just going to copy this code and paste it here at the bottom, because now I don't want to get from public, but from staging, and check if the data is now really included there. and I see that there is nothing included, unfortunately. So that's why we need to double check again and see if there are any problems, any mistakes. And now this is not working because we have of course forgotten to also output the data. So this can be some things that happen, and that's why we want to go back to get last load sales. And of course here we have seen that the data is retrieved, so it's input, this is great, but we also want to write it back into the table. So this is a simple step, but we should not of course forget that. That's why we search for output and table output in here. And now we of course want to double click, and since this is staging, we also want to truncate the table. We can search for the table schema, which is with quotes, staging, so that it's case sensitive. Of course, the table name is just sales. And we have checked truncate table box, and then also the database fields we can check. Go to database fields, get fields, everything looks okay, except this last load date we can remove, and all of that mapping is correct. So we have exactly the same column names, so we don't need to make any changes in here. We can just click on OK, and now of course we need to save that again. So we just click on save current file, and now we can again execute our staging job. We can run it, and now we have some problem. So we need to dive into what is the problem here exactly. I suggest that we scroll to the top, because in here we usually see where the problem is occurring. And we see indeed that if we scroll to the top, that column cost is type numeric, but expression is of type character. So this is now really something that can occur as well, that we have sometimes different data types, and that's why we also need to set those data types. So we can see that in the source data we can just maybe query that table. So we can see in the staging it is already numeric, how it's supposed to be, but for some reason, if we have a look at the source, we see that in here it is not a numeric value, but a character. And this is not what we would expect. That's why we see the error, and we can easily fix it. So this is how we would do it. And again, this was just again a practical example of how we could trail and find some errors and also solve them. So what we are going to do is we go back to this transformation, and we now also need to include the data type change. We can do this with select values. So we search for values, and we should find select values, and we want to include that in our workflow. So after we have queried the table, we can just place that in here in the middle. So we want to just put it in between. And then we can double click, and now in the tab metadata, we want to change the cost field and not rename it, but we want to change the data type to number. So then we have matching data type. So this is very important. We now want to save it again, and now one more try, and hopefully now things should be fixed and things should work. This looks already good. Now let's head over, and we also want to change it back to staging and see if now things are working, and indeed it works. So we have now successfully set up our staging for our fact table. And now in the next lecture, we want to make all of the transformations and set up our core layers. And of course, we want to start with the dimension. So we want to dive into the payment dimension, and that's what we are going to do in the next lecture.